What can you expect from this course? Let's together take a look at the structure. As I already mentioned in the video on the landing page, this course is very practice oriented. And you can already see that in its structure. First of all, we'll take a look at how reading works, and there you will get to know the 5 stages of learning how to read. Little spoiler, most of us so far only made it to stage 3. After that, we're gonna assess your current reading level. This will show us where we are right now and where we wanna go later. This means we're gonna have a little reading test in which we wanna assess your effective reading rate. For now, it's not that important how you calculate this rate. You will learn that later in the course. The important thing about it is that it gives you both a good measure on how many words you can read in 1 minute and also how many you can understand in 1 minute. And this value is extremely important. And our goal throughout this course is to get your effective reading rate as high as possible. After we've assessed your current reading level, we are going to take a look at the different factors that have an impact on our reading success. Because there are some factors that are really important. And then we already get started with our speed reading techniques. I will present you each technique in a little video and show you how you can practice it, and then after that we will have a practice text where you can apply all of that. So 1 practice text per technique. It's your choice which techniques you use and which you don't use. You can see them a little bit like a toolbox. And for different kinds of texts you can use different tools. And I'm pretty sure that there are some that will really help you. Once we're done with the techniques, we'll have a second reading assessment. There we will probably already be able to observe some first progress. But as you know, practice makes perfect. That's why after that we're going to have a whole section that is only consisting of exercises. It is full with exercises, activities and reading texts. And once we're done with this section, we're going to have another reading assessment. And this time I'm really sure that you're going to see some progress. Because it's one thing to know the techniques and another pair of shoes to apply them. That's why practice is so important. And that's why the focus of this course is on practice. I want you to be able to actually apply what we learn here. So practice, practice, practice. After that, we're going to take a look at some best practices for reading and learning, which are not directly linked to speed reading, but they will help you anyway. Not only for reading, also for learning. In this context, we will also, for example, talk about the flow state. And then once we're done with that, I'm going to show you where you can apply speed reading. And I can tell you it's not only reading. There are some possible applications that go way beyond reading. And then once we're done with all of that, we're going to have our final test. This is the last assessment of your reading speed and your effective reading rate. And I can already guarantee you that you're going to be able to observe a lot of progress. And I will also show you how you can create your own reading assessments. This will allow you to even have more practice and to track your progress. And finally, we're going to have a little summary and I will show you possible next steps. So your speed reading journey has only just begun after this course and you will continue to see further improvements. So you see, we've got a lot to cover, so let's get started. In our next lesson, we will start with the question, what is reading? See you then. Why should you learn speed reading? Or what benefits do you have from speed reading? In order to be able to understand that, let's take a look at the average reading speed of a person in the OECD. So 37 of the strongest and most developed countries in the world. In order to be able to measure reading speed, we use what is called the effective reading weight. In a later video you will learn how to calculate it, but for now it's just important that it tells you how many words you are able to read and understand them at the same time in just 1 minute. So we look at the words per minute, or WPM. The OECD average of this value is between 150 and 200 words per minute. Doesn't sound too bad, does it? But what do you think? What's the world record? How fast can people read? The fastest reader in the world and current world record holder is the US-American Sean Adams, and his reading speed is incredible. He managed to read at a staggering 3,850 words per minute. 3,850 words per minute. Insane, isn't it? That's more than 20 times the OECD average. That's what the human brain is capable of if you let it. Now, I'm not going to tell you that at the end of this course you will be able to read 20 times as fast as you are now, but with the right techniques and enough practice, it's more than likely that you will be able to double or even triple your current reading speed. On the contrary, it should be your goal. Maybe you know the proverb, shoot for the stars and you land on the moon. That's why I encourage you to set a high goal, and I can guarantee you that with enough practice and using the techniques that we cover in this course, you will definitely be able to at least double your reading speed. And if you don't, this course has a 30-day money-back guarantee. So doubling or tripling the average translates into something between 300 and 400 WPM or even more. 300 to 400 is definitely realistic, and the more the better. Remember, the higher you set your goal, the more you will achieve. Shoot for the stars and you'll land on the moon. Now you might be wondering, how does this help me? As you've probably already noticed, in our everyday-to-day life, we read a lot. Not only in books, also on your smartphone, on signs, menus, basically everything. On average, a person in the OECD reads about 2 hours per day. 2 hours, and that's a lot. Be it an email, the latest news, or whatever. Now imagine that you were able to cut this 2 hours per day down to 1 hour per day. What impact would this have? Well, first of all, 1 hour saved per day equals 7 hours saved per week. And over the whole year, this adds up to about 364 hours saved in an entire year. So almost 15 days. 15 days, that's almost half a month saved time. Can you imagine that? That's awesome. That's more than the entire vacation time of an average US worker. 15 days saved. And what can you do with this saved time? You could, for example, do all of the things that you like and that you don't have time for. Do more sports, relax, or even read more. Everything is possible, and at times like these, where our brains are flooded with information, it's great to be able to process them as fast and as efficiently as possible. Because speed reading doesn't only allow you to save a lot of time, it also makes you more concentrated and helps you to understand more of the text. This almost sounds too good to be true, right? But it has to do with the fact that your brain is always working at 100% brain capacity. Always. And if you don't give it enough input, so if you don't tell it what it needs to work on, it will find task itself. And most of the time this task is evaluating past situations. And I'm pretty sure that you can relate to that. Maybe you've had a difficult discussion a few days ago with a friend, there was a past event that happened, and whenever you're trying to concentrate, this thought pops up again and your brain tries to reevaluate the situation, which doesn't help you at all, but it keeps you from focusing. That's why when you're reading, it's very important to use 100% of your brain capacity, and speed reading allows you to do exactly that. So you see, speed reading is a skill that helps you a lot in the 21st century. And in order for you to be able to actually be able to use speed reading to your advantage by completion of this course, I made this course as practically oriented as possible. This course contains loads and loads of exercises, techniques, speed reading tests, and so on. And I'm really encouraging you to do as much of them as you can, because only with practice you can learn such an amazing skill as speed reading. Okay, now you know what speed reading is all about and why you need it. Now it's time to get into it. In order to be able to understand the speed reading techniques in our next section, we will take a look at reading in general, so how we read and how we learn how to read. And I can guarantee you, for most of you, it will be surprising. See you then. Before we start with the topic of reading speed and before we assess your current reading speed, let's first take a closer look on reading in general. So, what is reading and how do we do it? When you look for a definition, you'll often find something like that reading is a complex cognitive process of decoding symbols to derive meaning. That means that reading doesn't happen on the page that you read or the device that you read from, but it happens in your brain because the meaning needs to be decoded in your brain first. That's why the same text can have a different meaning depending on the person who's reading it. Different persons can interpret the same text differently, and that often has to do with their previous knowledge and ideals. So the main aim of reading overall is that we read in order to understand. We try to understand as much as possible in as little time as possible. If, for example, you're reading a non-fiction book, you will try to understand as much as possible in order to get a maximum benefit. Because you want to know, for example, how something works or how to do something. For fiction, it's a little different, but not much. Here your aim will most likely be to be able to follow the plot. You want the story to unfold in your brain or in your eyes as naturally as possible, and in order to be able to do that, you want to understand as much as possible in as little time as possible. So you can see in both cases, both non-fiction and fiction, our main aim is to understand as much as possible in as little time as possible. And that's where speed reading comes in, because speed reading helps you achieve both of these things. Imagine your brain like a computer and the text as the programming language. Your brain or the computer first needs to convert what it can see into something that it can work with. So the computer does this by converting the programming language into zeros and ones. And your brain does this by converting the words, phrases and sentences from the text into actual meaning. So how do we do that? How do we read? Basically, there are 5 stages of reading. And in our next lesson, we will take a closer look on each individual stage. Spoiler alert, most of us haven't even reached stage 4. But more about that in our next video. In this lesson, we will take a look at the 5 stages of reading. So, how do you learn how to read? If you like, you can pause the video and reflect a little bit on how you learned how to read. When did you learn how to read and what method did you or the teacher use? In most cases, it works like this. First of all, you learn the language. That's especially the case for your mother tongue. First, you learn it orally, so you learn the mouth-to-mouth language. And then when you go to primary school, you learn how to identify letters. And that's already stage number 2. Stage number 1, learn the language. Stage number 2, identify letters. And then once you've developed a feeling for the different letters, you move on with identifying words. And that is stage number 3. So first you learn the language, then you learn how to identify letters, and then how to identify words. If you learn how to read in your second language or third language, those steps are less clear, but they still do exist. And for most people, stage 3 is the end of their reading journey. Most people never make it to stage 4 or stage 5, and they don't even know that they exist. But it doesn't need to end here. If you think about it, the next logical step would need to be to identify word groups. So for example, that you read in the house as in the house and not in the house. Just like you're now able to read the word house as house and not H-O-U-S-E. So you made it one step further. You now know how to identify words and you don't need to combine all of the letters to the word. And the same thing also can be done with word groups. This doesn't happen overnight, but it works. And once you've mastered that, you can even go one step further. As I mentioned, we have 5 steps of reading and our 5th stage is to identify entire texts or lines of text. Only a tiny percentage of people make it to this stage, but I can guarantee you it is possible. And those 2 last stages, identifying word groups and identifying entire lines of text, this is what we call speed reading. That's where speed reading comes in. Throughout this course, I will be showing you lots and lots of techniques that will help you achieve exactly that. But not only that, we also do a lot of exercises, and that's important because change doesn't happen overnight. Don't expect that only by listening to the videos your reading speed will double or even triple. It's all about practice. So please do all of the exercises and also the reading tests. It will help you a lot, and I can guarantee you if you do all of that, you will be seeing great improvements in your reading speed. Speaking of your reading speed, in our next lesson we will take a look at the words per minute, which is a unit that allows you to identify your reading speed. How you can do that and what else you need to know about the words per minute, that's what you will learn in our next lesson. See ya! So what exactly is fast reading or speed reading? How do you assess and evaluate your reading speed? That's what we will learn in this video. In order to be able to assess and evaluate your reading speed, we use the unit WPM or words per minute. As you can probably imagine, this unit shows how many words you are able to read in just 1 minute. It gives you a great overview on your current standing and your learning and reading progress. What's more, the WPM allows you to calculate your effective reading rate. And this effective reading rate is even more accurate because it tells you both how fast you read, but also how much you understand of what you read. You can calculate it by multiplying your reading speed in words per minute by your comprehension in percent. This gives you the amount of words that you are able to understand in 1 minute. For example, if your reading speed is 250 words and you understand about 80% of the text, then you have 250 WPM multiplied by 0.8 and you get an effective reading rate of 200 words per minute. So you are able to read and understand 200 words per minute. So on paper you would have read 250 words and of those 250 words you would have understood about 200 words. Our aim here at this speed reading course is to get this number, so your effective reading rate, as high as possible. But in order to achieve that, for now the most important step is to assess your current reading speed. So how do we do that? We'll now have our first reading assessment. I will give you a text and your task is to read as much of it as you can in 1 minute. Don't worry if you don't make it to the end, that's the purpose of the text. If you manage to make it to the end of this text within 1 minute, you don't need this course. Once 1 minute is over, Please count the words from the beginning to the point where you stopped reading. So you can see calculating your words per minute is not really calculating, it's counting. But there are also some word counter tools available, and I'll link you one down below. After that, we will have a little quiz about the topics that were covered in the text. The quiz consists of 5 questions, and the purpose of the quiz is in order to be able to evaluate your reading comprehension. Because, as you know, we want to calculate your effective reading rate. So if you manage to answer all 5 questions correctly, your comprehension is 100%. So your effective reading rate would be exactly the same as your reading speed. If you answer 4 questions correctly, your comprehension is 80% and you multiply it by 0.8. If 3 questions are correct, you multiply it by 0.6 and so on. And this allows you to calculate your current effective reading rate. For now, it's not that important what's a good effective reading rate and what's a bad effective reading rate, but I'll tell you more on that in the evaluation of this test. For now, good luck and enjoy your first reading assessment. See you in the next video. So, how did it go? How was your first reading assessment? Let's take a look at where you stand. First of all, the average reading speed in the OECD, so 37 of the most developed countries in the world, is between 150 and 200 words per minute. So that's their average effective reading rate, 150 to 200. So as you can see, if your reading speed in the assessment was below 150, you are below average. If it's between 150 and 200, you have an average reading speed, and everything above 200 is a little above average. Don't worry if your reading speed is average or below average, that only means that you can get even more out of this course. But 150 to 200 WPM is just the average. Our brain is capable of processing many more words than just 150 to 200. And it's possible to double or even to triple that number. Not only that, what do you think the world record is? What do you think the highest effective reading rate is so far? I can tell you it's 3,850 words per minute. 3,850 words per minute. That's insane, isn't it? That's the amazing record of Sean Adam. His reading speed is more than 20 times faster than the OECD average. More than 20 times. And he's not the only one who's reading that fast. The top 10 highest reading speeds are all well above 1,500 words per minute. Most of these speed readers come from the US, the Netherlands, Great Britain and Norway. And those are also the countries where speed reading emerged and where it at least is partly taught. Now, I'm not going to promise you that at the end of this course you're going to be able to read 20 times as fast than you are now. But as I already mentioned, it's well possible to double or even triple that number. Not only that, it should really be your expectation of this course. So if, for example, your current reading speed is 200 WPM, then I would recommend that your goal is at least 400. Of course, this is only possible if you do all of the exercises, but if you keep practicing, I'm pretty sure that you will arrive at this point. And if you don't, I'm more than happy to give you back your money. As you know, this course has a 30-day money-back guarantee, so if the course doesn't match your expectations, feel free to use it. But as I already mentioned, if you not only watch the videos, but also do the exercises and learn the techniques, you and I can be more than confident that you will largely increase your reading speed. So now we know where we are and what our aim is for this course. But how do we achieve that? In this course I will be showing you many important techniques and exercises, but before we start with that, in our next section we first have to look at the factors that are involved in your reading success, because only if we know these factors we can change our behavior to optimize them. You will learn more on that in our next lesson. See ya! So what are these success factors? Overall, apart from the speed reading techniques that we are about to learn, your reading success is determined by 3 main factors, which are your focus, concentration and attentiveness, your motivation, and your background knowledge. Those 3 factors are the reason for whether you achieve your reading aim and understand the text that you are reading, or whether you read the text and you think, huh? What's that all about? So in order to ensure maximum reading success, it is super important that your focus and your concentration is as high as possible, that you're motivated, in the best case intrinsically motivated, and that you have enough background knowledge to understand the text. This chapter will be all about these 3 factors and how to improve all of them. You will see that there's a lot that you can do to influence these 3 factors. But enough talking. In our next lesson we will start with focus, concentration and attentiveness. Your focus, concentration and attentiveness is one of the most important factors for your reading success. But what do we mean by these terms? Both focus and concentration mean using all available resources to successfully achieve a goal. If your goal is reading a book, for example, it means that you use all available brain capacity to achieve this goal, so to read the book. But there is a little difference between the two, so between focus and concentration, because you can be focused and not be concentrated at the same time, and vice versa. This has to do with a tiny little difference between the two. If, for example, a student has to write an assignment and he needs to write multiple assignments at the same time, he is not focused, but he can still be concentrated. So his focus is not on a special task, but if he's still working with concentration, his concentration can still be high. The same also goes vice versa. If a student only has one task, so finish one assignment, but his thoughts are anywhere but with the assignment, he is focused but not concentrated. That's the difference between the two. And in an ideal situation, you need both focus and concentration, because both focus and concentration are very important for your reading success. If you can't focus because you have to do multiple things at the same time, this will not help you at all to understand the text. And if you're not concentrated because, let's say, you didn't sleep that well last night, this will definitely also not improve your reading success. So how can you improve both of these things? I have 2 tips for you. The first tip is multitasking is not effective at all. And it's not just me who's saying that. Most studies about that topic have been showing that it's a lot less effective than doing each task individually. So do everything step by step. The most important thing here is to avoid distractions, and this also includes things like your phone, for example. For example, if you're reading a book, please put your phone away, because maybe you also know this feeling. You're reading something and then suddenly you just want to check your messages, and you don't really pay that close attention, but then 20 minutes later you realize that your thoughts completely drifted away and that you've spent more than 20 minutes simply doing things at your phone without even realizing it. And to avoid this problem, put your phone away. And then once you're done with the task, you can use your phone without feeling bad about it. The other piece of advice that I can give you is use 100% of your brain capacity. This might sound a little weird to you right now, but your brain always uses 100% of its capacity. The problem is if you don't use it with your task, your brain will find other ways to work at 100%. Most of the time it's evaluating past situations, and you know this feeling. Maybe you were in a discussion a few days ago, and while you're reading, your brain is still thinking about this. You can avoid that by using 100% of your brain capacity for reading. And a good way to do that is by using the speed reading techniques that I will give you, because they will be much more demanding for your brain. But if there is still a thought that is distracting you from reading, then no problem. Write it down on a sheet of paper and then come back later to it. This will help you not to forget the thought, but also to be able to focus on what's important now and then to be able to later come back to that thought. So try to keep distractions at a minimum. Alright, that's enough about concentration and focus. In our next lesson we will move on with motivation, another very important factor. Another extremely important factor for your reading success is motivation. Maybe you know that too. You're reading a text that you really like and that you're really motivated about, and after just a few hours or a few days, you're already done with it. You've read the whole book and you even know what's in there. On the other hand, if you have to read something that you really are not motivated to read, like let's say one old English classic that you have to read for school, it takes days, weeks, or even months and you still don't know what's in there. That's how powerful motivation is. Research shows that there's a direct correlation between motivation and success, especially between motivation and reading success. However, there are 2 types of motivation, and maybe you already heard of them. They are intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is every kind of motivation that is directly linked to your task. So if you're intrinsically motivated for reading, for example, you are motivated because you like the book or because you want to learn something that's in the book. If you are extrinsically motivated, on the other hand, that's a kind of motivation that is only indirectly linked to your task. So in the example of reading, for example, you're not motivated by the text itself or what's in the text, but because you know that by reading this text you achieve something else, so a second thing. For example, if you need to read something in order to pass a class, for example, or if you know that you will earn some money if you read something. Those are 2 examples for extrinsic motivation. So which one is better? Research shows that both intrinsic and extrinsic motivation are better than no motivation, but intrinsic motivation is always better than extrinsic motivation. That's because if you're really interested in the text, for example, it's a lot easier for you to read it and to understand it than if you're simply motivated because by reading the text you achieve something else. But still, as I already mentioned, both kinds of motivation are better than no motivation. So, what can you do to be more motivated, especially in situations where you're absolutely not? One way would be to try to create intrinsic motivation by scanning the book or text for something that you're really interested in. Maybe this feature will spark your interest in the text itself, and it will make it much easier for you to read and understand the text. But if there's nothing like that, you can also work with extrinsic motivation, and that might be a little easier. And this can be as easy as, for example, saying that if you manage to read the whole text, you will treat yourself to something. For example, with a chocolate or with a trip to a place that you want to visit. There are endless possibilities. And all of that can help you kickstart your extrinsic motivation. So now we already know 2 of the 3 success factors for reading. So after focus, concentration, and motivation, it's now time for the background knowledge. In our next lesson, you will learn why background knowledge is so important and what you can do to improve it. And a little spoiler, it involves more than you think. See you then. For your understanding and reading speed, your background knowledge is extremely important. And this brings us to our 3rd and last factor for reading success, which is our background knowledge. If, for example, you're reading a detailed article about quantum physics and you don't know anything about it, it will be really difficult for you to understand it. If, on the other hand, you know a lot about food and specific diets and you read an article about the keto diet, for example, this will be a lot easier. All of that has to do with background knowledge. But background knowledge is not only the expertise in a specific area, it is also knowing the words and phrases in this area. That's why some texts are extremely easy for you to read because you already know most of the words and it's easier for your brain to detect these words, while there are other texts which are really hard to read because it's really hard for your brain to detect sentence structure, words, and so on. That's also why people who read a lot tend to understand more when they read a new text because they know more words and more phrases. It's as always, practice is key. So your background knowledge can be very different in specific topic areas, and it also depends not only on your expertise in the specific area, but also on the knowing of words and phrases. Maybe you do remember that in one of our first lessons, we learned that reading is a complex process of decoding symbols. So the more symbols and the more combinations of symbols you know, the easier it becomes. You need to derive the meaning from these symbols, and the more you already know about the meaning in this area, the easier it becomes. If we're not able to do that because we don't have enough expertise or we don't know the words, I have 2 tips for you that you can use in those situations. Tip number 1 is a little more difficult to do. It is start with easy texts on the same topic and then work your way up. If, for example, you have a highly specialized text on quantum physics, start by easy introducing articles on that topic. Then, once you've understood these texts, gradually move your way up. The more you read about it, the easier it becomes, and suddenly you will be able to read the whole text. But of course, that takes a lot of time, and that's why I also have a second piece of advice for you. It is skim the text first in order to get a feel for the text. So when you first skim a text, you get a feel for the structure of the text, maybe you already see some first words, and that also gives you some kind of background knowledge. It doesn't need to take that long, but it will already help you for your real reading. By the way, this is also one of the speed reading techniques, but more on that in a later video. But basically the idea of this technique is to get as much background knowledge as possible in order to be able to read and understand the text as smoothly as possible. Alright, so those are the 3 main factors for your reading abilities. Your focus and concentration, your motivation, and your background knowledge. Now it's time to start with the practical part of this course. In our next section, we will start with our first speed reading techniques. Are you ready? Let's jump into it. Before we all jump into the different speed reading techniques, here first a few ideas about this section. In each video I will be showing you a new technique, and after that video we will have a practice text. This practice text is a little shorter than the texts we have in our reading assessments, but the whole idea about the practice texts is for you to be able to practice the new technique. You don't need to use them, but you can, and I really recommend it. The sooner and the more you apply the new techniques, the better. In these practice texts, you don't need a stopwatch and you don't need to stop your time. It's really only about trying out the new techniques. Be aware that this is not a reading assessment. After the end of this section, we will have another reading assessment, and there you will see whether you've already made some progress after learning these techniques. Maybe you're already familiar with some of the techniques, but I'm pretty sure that there are also some techniques that are new to you. You can view it as a toolbox. You don't need to use all of the tools that I give you, so all of the techniques, but the aim is to find out which ones work best for you and then to use these tools. I mean, for example, if you want to cut something in half, you are more likely to use a saw than a screwdriver, aren't you? And the same also goes for these techniques. My advice is to try all of them and also to practice them with the corresponding texts. This allows you to find out which ones don't work for you and which ones do. Guarantee you there will be at least one that will help you. Alright, that's everything you need to know before starting with the techniques, and I would say let's jump right in. We'll start with chunking. Finally, the time has come. We have now arrived at our first speed reading technique, which is chunking. As you can probably guess from the word, in this technique we use chunks. So we try to read in word groups which are called chunks. Maybe you still remember the video about the 5 stages of reading. There we learned that our 4th stage of reading is identifying entire word groups. So instead of reading each word individually, we try to read word groups individually. So something like on the table becomes on the table. Just like table became table a few years ago, when we learned how to convert letters into words. So we try to identify each chunk with our eyes. First up, this one is one of the harder techniques that we have at speed reading, so don't worry if it feels difficult at first. There are some other techniques that are a little easier, so just so you know. A great method to learn chunking is to use a sheet of paper and then to divide it into 3 thirds. You can do this by drawing lines or also by folding the sheet. And now every line of text should be divided into thirds. And those thirds are our chunks. Every line consists of 3 chunks. And as I already mentioned, our goal is to identify chunk per chunk, not word by word, chunk per chunk. This might sound a little odd or difficult at first, but it's all a matter of practice. So feel free to try it out with our new practice text. As I already mentioned, after each video we have a practice text. And you can both access this practice text via the corresponding lesson, or you can use it as a PDF file and then you can print it out if you like. And the upside of printing it out is that you can actually fold it or draw lines on it, and then you can do the same task that I just told you. Divide the text into thirds and then identify chunk per chunk. Print it out or use the on-screen version and give it a try. In our next video we will move on with our next technique, which is the extension of your viewing span. See you then. Closely related to chunking is also our next technique, which is the extension of our viewing span. As I already mentioned, most people, when they read, they focus word per word per word. And that takes a lot of time. If you take a closer look on a camera, for example, you can observe that whenever you change your position, the camera both takes time to adapt to the new position and to sharpen. This can also be called fixation, and it's basically the same thing that also happens in your eyes. As you probably know, your eyes also have lenses, and they also constantly need to adapt and to fixate. So your eyes basically do the same thing as the camera. It just takes them a little less time. Your eyes first need time to move into the right position and then they need time to focus again, to sharpen. Accordingly, you save a lot of time if you manage to cut down the numbers of fixation points. Instead, you can try to improve your peripheral vision. In the exercise section of this course, you will find many useful exercises to do exactly that. For now, let's have another reading exercise. I will again give you a little text. And this time we're gonna have 2 rounds. In round 1, we're gonna do a little self-experiment. Try to read the text in the way that you would normally read a text. And then focus on how many fixation points you have. For an average person it will probably look something like this. But with a little practice and by strengthening your peripheral vision, you can cut this number of fixation points down to something like that. Those are a lot less, right? And that will also be our aim for round 2. In round 2, your task will be to try to have as little fixation points as possible. The fewer you have, the better. Maybe you already noticed that if you open our practice text in the digital version here on Udemy, the lines are more narrow than if you use the PDF version. So they are not as wide and don't contain that many words as if you would take a look at the PDF version, for example. But this has an advantage for you, because it allows you to even have fewer fixation points per line of text. So try to direct your vision to the middle of each line, and then from there, without changing the position of your eyes, try to identify all of the words of the line. If that doesn't work, don't worry, you can also use 2 fixation points, one on the left and one on the right. And if that doesn't work, use 3 of them, but I'm pretty sure that you will make it in 2. As you know, the fewer fixation points, the better. I know at first that might feel a little weird, and it might be tough at first, but the more you practice it, the easier it gets and the more natural it gets. It's only a matter of practice. Try out for yourself. First, do the self-experiment, and then try to have as little fixation points as possible. And once you're done with that, you're ready for our next speed reading technique, which is visualizing texts. More about that in our next lesson. See ya! You probably already know the next technique that I'm gonna show you. It is visualizing texts, and it's done a lot at school. And it has a lot to do with understanding and comprehending texts. In order to visualize texts, you can use, for example, mind maps, keyword collections, and more. Now, you might be wondering, if it's called speed reading, why should I take more time just to visualize texts? And that's a good question. The answer is that the promise of speed reading is not only to be able to read texts faster, but also more efficiently. It means that you also want to understand more of what you read. We not only want to read faster, we also want to understand more and want to have fewer distractions. Of course, if you have a short and easy text, you don't need to visualize it. This technique is meant for long, complicated texts, such as specialist texts, where it's not easy to stay on track. For this kind of texts, it really makes sense to visualize them. My personal favorites are mind maps, but it's up to you how you visualize them. No matter whether you read a long book or a tough specialized text in a scientific journal, in these situations it can really make sense to use a mind map, especially when there are multiple thoughts or multiple plots at once. A great side effect of mind maps is also that they allow you to find out the focus of the text. Most of the time the focus corresponds to the title, but not always. And in those situations you can quickly find out with the help of a mind map. But enough talk, let's have some more practice. I'm now going to give you another practice text and I would like you to visualize it. This text will be a lot longer than the other practice texts, but that's because for short texts it doesn't really make sense to visualize them. You can read it the way you want to. You can use your normal reading techniques, or you can also use some of our speed reading techniques. It's all up to you as long as you visualize the text. That being said, enjoy reading and visualize it, and I'll see you in our next lesson. The next technique that I want to show you is less a new technique, but more breaking with old habits. And by old habits, I'm especially referring to regression and subvocalization. Let's take a look at what those two terms mean and how you can avoid them. Do you know that too? You're reading a long text and suddenly you stop because you don't know where you are, or you even jump back a few lines. This pattern is called regression. It either happens when you don't understand what you read, or when you realize that over the past few lines you haven't been paying attention to the text at all. And this habit can be referred to as regression, and it's pretty hard to get rid of. I mean, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It makes sense to look things up if you don't understand them. But very often this is a sign that your brain is not 100% working on reading. In this course we already learned that your brain is always working at 100% of its brain capacity. And if reading doesn't fill 100% of its capacity, it uses the rest of its capacity for other things. And that's what prevents you from being focused. And that's why a countermeasure in order to avoid regression is to set yourself a fixed time limit. This requires more of your brain capacity, thereby keeps you more focused and avoids regression. At one point you feel like you automatically jump back, although you understand what you're reading, also try to avoid that. Once your brain knows that it can't jump back, it tries to understand everything with the first reading. Try it out for yourself and I'm pretty sure that you will have fewer regressions. The other habit that we want to get rid of is the so-called subvocalization. Subvocalization is your internal speech that you make when you're reading. At primary school we learned to read aloud, and then later we learned how to move this loud external voice back into our heads, and now we have our internal voice. This is what is called subvocalization, and it keeps you from reading faster. So it's basically a tool that helped you at the time, but now it's not of usage for you anymore. It only keeps you from making more progress. Just like the supporting wheels when you're trying to learn how to ride a bike. At first they're a great help, but later they are kind of annoying and they prevent you from making more progress. So put away your training wheels and avoid subvocalization. One simple countermeasure in order to do that is chewing gum. You will see that once your jaw is occupied, you are a lot less likely to subvocalize. And of course, you can't always chew gum when you're reading, but that is only the first step. Once your brain is accustomed to cut out subvocalization, it will become natural and will help you a lot. So use our next practice text to try it out for yourself. Try to avoid regression and subvocalization, you will see that it will make you a faster and more efficient reader. In our next lesson we will move on with skimming. See ya then! Alright, now it's time for our next speed reading technique. This time we're going to look at skimming. Skimming, in the sense of skimming over a text, is a great technique to get a first overview of a text. In the video about background knowledge, we already learned how important background knowledge is, and that knowing specific words and the structure of a text can already be background knowledge. That's why skimming is such an effective technique, especially for longer and more difficult texts. It's usually done in the following way. The idea is to read the text twice. First time you skim the text, so you take a look at the structure and look for specific keywords, and then you move on with the actual reading. You will see that the actual reading will become much easier once you've done the skimming before that. What's more is that skimming already allows you to get a pretty good insight into the text in very, very little time. This has to do with the so-called Pareto principle. It's a principle by the Italian economist Vilfredo Pareto, and it states that in most areas of life, only 20% of actions are responsible for 80% of outcomes. On the flip side, 80% of actions are only responsible for 20% of the outcomes. This means that if we identify those 20%, we are able to get 80% of outcomes. Or translated into reading, this means that 20% of effort responsible for reading gives you 80% of all the main points of a text. And when you are skimming, you are trying to identify those 20%. The only exception to this rule are didactically prepared texts. Those texts are texts where the information is usually packed that densely that you don't need to skim them at all. In those cases, almost everything is important and not only 20%. But still, for all of the other texts, it's important to identify the 20% of the text that contain 80% of all of the main points. The same is also true for other areas of life. For example, 20% of all products are responsible for 80% of the revenue. Or 20% of drivers are responsible for 80% of all traffic accidents. I think you get the point. It's really important to skim what is important of a text, and it will help you to actually read the text and understand it. Especially when you combine it with our next technique, which is determining your reading target. Another really helpful technique, especially for reading long texts, is to determine a reading target. This means that before you start reading the text, you ask yourself, what benefits do I want to have from the text? And what do I want to know from the text? Once you know both of these things, you know exactly what you need to focus on when you're reading the text. Especially if you have a book of, about 500 pages, and you know that you don't want to read the whole book, but you just need some pieces of information, then it comes in really handy to know exactly what you want. I mean, for example, if you're reading a book about vegetables and the only information that you need is how often you need to water your tomatoes, then you really only have to look for this specific fact. If, on the other hand, you're reading a novel or a short text, you don't have to set yourself a reading target. It always depends on the text and your time budget. Imagine your brain like a scanner. If the whole text or the whole book is important, you need to scan the whole book. If, on the other hand, only parts of it are important for you, you only need to scan these parts. Or to put it in other words, it should scan the book for only these things. And that's our aim. And you will see that in our next technique, the SQ3R method, we will combine both skimming a text, setting a reading target, and also some other aspects. This will prepare you especially for reading tougher texts like studies and long scientific books. The SQ3R method is one of the most used reading techniques at university, especially in English-speaking countries. But what does SQ3R stand for? Each of these letters is the initial letter of one of the actions that you take. We start with the S for survey. In this step, you try to get a first overview of the text. This is where skimming, for example, comes in. You take a look at the structure, the table of contents, the different headlines, and so on. Then you move on with step number 2, the Q or question. This step is all about determining your reading target. So basically what we talked about in the last video. You try to find out what you need to know from the text and how it might help you. Then we move on with the actual reading process, because the first R is for read. So we read the text while already having in mind the first two steps, which were survey and question. Then once we are done with reading, we move on with the second R, which is review. In this step, we try to rephrase the content of the text in our own words. This doesn't only help us to store these things in our memory, it also shows us whether we've achieved our reading target. And then finally we have our final R, our final step, which is recite. In this final step we try to evaluate the text and try to find the essence of it. That means we look for the overarching topic and try to embed it into the context of everything we've learned so far about the same topic. So if, for example, you already read some other books about the same topic, you compare and contrast the ideas of this book in comparison to the others. So survey, question, read, review, and recite. Let's repeat that one more time. We had 5 steps, 2 before reading, 1 during reading, and 2 after reading. Our first 2 steps were survey and question, and they are the 2 steps that we do before reading. Then comes the actual reading process, and after we're done with that, we move on with review and recite, which are the steps we do after reading. And ideally, this helps us to successfully work on our reading targets. So if, for example, you need to do some research on a specific topic, this method can be of great help for you. It was developed in order to better understand longer and complicated texts. On the other hand, it also means that you don't need it for short and easy texts. So really only use it if you need to. Maybe you already noticed that the last few techniques were not about increasing your reading speed, but about helping you understand more. That's because all of the methods that I've shown you in this section have a different focus. The first few were all about increasing your reading speed or reprogramming your brain. And now the last few ones were all about increasing your understanding of the text. Which ones you use and which ones you don't is up to you. But for all of these methods, practice is key. That's why it's really important that you practice them in order to master them. In our next section, we will move on with many exercises that will help you dive deeper into all of these methods. But before we're going to start with that, we're going to do a second reading assessment. In our next video, I will tell you everything you need to know before taking the assessment. See you then. Alright, now that you know the different speed reading techniques, it's time for our second reading assessment. The procedure is the same as last time. You need a stopwatch and the text. And you will find the text in the next lesson. In case that you don't have a stopwatch, I'll link a free stopwatch tool down below. But alternatively, you can also use your smartphone, your tablet, or whatever. So, the idea stays the same. You have 1 minute to read as many words as possible in the text. Then, after 1 minute, count the words and then put the text away for 2 minutes. Then, after the 2 minutes are over, please do the quiz. The idea behind the quiz is that you don't only want to read fast, but also to understand what you read, and that's why we are trying to assess whether you've managed to do both. The quiz consists of 5 questions. If you answer all 5 of them correctly, your effective reading rate is simply your words per minute multiplied by 1, so your words per minute. If you answer 4 questions correctly, you multiply your words per minute by 0.8. If you answer 3 correctly, you multiply them by 0.6, and so on. And once you know your effective reading rate, we'll compare it to your effective reading rate from reading assessment 1. And then we will see whether you've already made some first improvements. Alright, let's get into it. Good luck and enjoy! So, how did it go? Did you manage to improve your effective reading rate compared to last time? If yes, great! You will see the more techniques you apply and the more practice you get in these techniques, the easier it will get and the faster you will be able to read. If you didn't see any progress so far, then don't bury your head in sand. Practice is key to learning a skill like speed reading. It's not something that you learn overnight. That's why I'm really sure that if you keep practicing, you will see progress. Quick reminder, the OECD average is about 150 to 200 words per minute as an effective reading rate. So if you have more than 200, you're already above average, but above average is not our goal. Our goal is to double or even triple our reading speed, so about 300 to 400 words per minute. That's why our next section will be all about practice. Here we will have different exercises on all of the different techniques. So chunking, expanding your viewing span, skimming, and so on. And there are also some other exercises that will help you improve your concentration, for example. As I already mentioned, practice is so important to learning this, and that's why I'm really encouraging you to do all of the exercises. There might be some that are more useful for you and some that are less, but I can tell you the more that you practice, the better it is. So please take the time and do all of the exercises. And then, once we're done with all of the exercises, we will do another reading assessment. And then I am pretty sure that you will see some progress. Let's find out. Alright, now that we have had a lot of practice, it's time for our third reading assessment. Let's see whether you were able to improve your effective reading rate. The procedure stays the same. You only need the text that I will give you and a stopwatch. And then we're already ready to go. Try to read as many words as you can within 1 minute. Then count the words and have a little break. After the break, do the quiz that will consist of 5 questions about the text. and then using the number of words that you counted and the amount of questions that you answered correctly, you are then able to calculate your effective reading rate. Are you ready? Then let's get started. So, how did it go? Did you manage to improve your reading speed compared to the other 2 reading tests? This time your aim should really be to have at least 250 to 300 words per minute. So significantly above average. As I already mentioned, practice is key to learning this. That's why if by now you haven't achieved your goals, what you need to do is practice, practice, practice. And if you do that, I'm really sure that you will achieve your goal. At the end of this course, we will do another reading assessment, and then I'm pretty sure that you will be ready by then. And not only that, I will also show you how you can make your own reading assessments. This will not only give you more practice, it also shows you how to track your progress. Until then, keep practicing, and in the next 2 sections, we will first take a look at best practices for reading and learning, and then we will also take a closer look at where we can apply what we've learned about speed reading. And a little fun fact, it goes way beyond only reading. But more on that in the next 2 sections. Before we're going to take a look at some best practices for reading and learning, let's first have a little revision of what affects your reading and learning success. Because when it comes to reading, there are 3 very important factors. And we already talked about them in a previous chapter. They are focus, motivation, and background knowledge. Each of the best practices that I'm going to show you in the next lesson are trying to improve one of these factors. They either try to improve your focus or concentration, they try to improve your motivation, or they try to improve your background knowledge. Because in order to improve our reading and learning, we need to improve our ability one of these 3 factors. And that's what these best practices are all about. Some of them might seem a little trivial or common sense, others might be a little more surprising. And you will see, the more of these best practices you apply in your day-to-day life, the more reading success and learning success you will have. So let's jump right into our best practices. This video will be all about some best practices in order to improve your learning and reading success. It's less about reading techniques because we already learned those, it's more about everything around that. As I already mentioned, each of these best practices tries to help you improve one of the 3 main success factors of reading. So your focus or concentration, your motivation, and your background knowledge. Let's go! We'll start with ways to improve your concentration. A really important factor for your concentration is the correct reading and learning environment. A great reading and learning environment is characterized by as little distraction as possible. This means in the best case scenario, there is nothing that keeps you from reading or learning. That means simple, neat, and tidy. A minimalist approach is the best approach here. If you don't need them for learning, please also put away your smartphone, your computer, your laptop, or whatever. Try to avoid everything that might attract your attention, even if it's a painting at the wall. Keep it simple and you will see that you will be a lot more concentrated. Apart from that, I can really recommend a comfortable and healthy seating position. Yes, seating position. I know it's also possible to read in a lying position, for example, in your bed or on a couch, for example. But if you don't read for your enjoyment, but you want to be focused and effective, then research has shown that a comfortable and healthy seating position will give you better results. That's why an ergonomic desk chair can be a really good investment. Apart from that, a healthy lifestyle is also really important for your concentration. I'm sure you know most of these things, but I'm still going to repeat them because most people kind of forget about them in their everyday to-day lives. Those are enough sleep, ideally about 8 hours per night, a healthy and balanced diet, drinking enough water and ideally no alcoholic beverages, or at least only small amounts of alcoholic beverages or coffee. And also do enough sports. All of these factors are important for a healthy lifestyle and they directly have an impact on your concentration. You won't believe how big the impact of sports and your diet is on your concentration and your reading skills. Good, that's all about improving your concentration. Now let's move on with your motivation. How can we improve our motivation? As we've already learned, there are 2 types of motivation: intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. And you can increase your motivation in both ways, both by increasing your intrinsic motivation and by increasing your extrinsic motivation. One way to increase your intrinsic motivation is by finding a specific part or feature of the text that you're really interested in. This will already increase your interest in the text as a whole, and by that spark your intrinsic motivation. Ideally, you already selected the text because you are interested in it, because it sounded interesting or you wanted to know about the topic. And that's amazing for your intrinsic motivation. If this is not the case, you can still try to improve your extrinsic motivation. You can try to do that by linking something to your task or the text that you want to read that doesn't have to do with the text itself. So for example, once you're done reading the text, you're going to treat yourself with some ice cream. Or you know that once you're done reading the text, you're better prepared to get that job that you want to have. Those are two examples for extrinsic motivation, and it's not nearly as good as intrinsic motivation, but still it's a lot better than if you have no motivation. Because you need something that drives you, otherwise learning or reading will be a really tough task. Finally, let's take a look at how we can improve our background knowledge. This is a little more difficult. Here I can give you a pretty trivial piece of advice, which is that if, for example, you have to read a pretty difficult text, like one about string theory, for example, you first start reading easier books about the same topic or about previous topics. And this will give you the background knowledge you need in order to be able to read the difficult text. Also, a good tip to improve your background knowledge is reading in general. Because the more you read, the more your brain is accustomed to identify words, and the easier it becomes for you to decode these words. Hence, reading itself becomes easier. And this is also some kind of background knowledge. My final piece of advice that I can give you to improve your background knowledge is one of the techniques that we've already had, which is skimming. So before you start actually reading a text, you first scan or skim it for some information. So you take a look at the table of contents, at the different headings, at the structure of the text, and this will give you a first impression. It will help you significantly for your second or actual reading, and that's also because it gives you some kind of background knowledge. The knowledge in this case is not technical knowledge, but knowledge about the text and the words that are in the text. So there you have it. Those are my best practices in order to improve your reading and your learning. And if you manage to apply most of them, it's not unlikely that you come into a flow state. What is a flow state? That's what you will learn in our next lesson. See you then. I'm sure you already heard about the term flow or flow state. That's a mental state in which a person is fully immersed in the activity that he or she is doing. In a flow state, you are so absorbed by your activity that you are very difficult to distract. In a flow state, people have a feeling of energized focus, full involvement and enjoyment. And it seems as if the time is running. An example for that is when you're drawing something and you're so immersed into drawing as perfectly and carefully as possible that you don't even realize that you're drawing, or that you don't even realize that you have been drawing for 2 or 3 hours. You are so mentally focused, everything else but your task becomes secondary. And this usually increases your productivity a lot. Flow states have been observed throughout many kinds of activities. In music, crafts, sports, art, basically anywhere. And it can also be observed for reading. Maybe you've also made this experience. There are some books or texts that we find so interesting, where we are so focused that we reach a state of flow, where it seems like time is flying, and after about 4 hours, you're done with the book. You've read the whole book. So you see, the flow state is kind of like the ultimate goal. But how do you get into a flow state? Apart from the 3 factors that we already talked about, so focus, motivation, and background knowledge, it's really important that you know about your own abilities. But in order to get into a flow state, you need to challenge yourself, but not overwhelm yourself. So your tasks should be challenging, but not frustrating. Maybe you do remember that your brain always works at 100% of its capacity. And in order to reach a flow state, you really want to occupy 100% of your brain capacity. If your task is too hard, your brain is overwhelmed. And if your task occupies too little of your brain activity, it becomes boring and it becomes very difficult to reach the flow state. That's why it's so important to set yourself realistic goals and also to recognize your own achievements. Because if you can observe that you make progress, this brings you further into your flow state. It's kind of like a positive feedback loop. And this can be really powerful. But what is also equally as important is that you keep distractions to a minimum. You want to have as little distraction as possible. Because once you've reached the flow state, it can still always be interrupted. And once it's interrupted, it makes poof, and your flow state is gone. And then it's pretty tough to get it back. That's why you should keep distractions to a minimum. Also, when we talk about challenging but not overwhelming ourselves, it's important to realize that when you get into a flow state, usually your brain also has a learning effect. This means that the next time you want to get into a flow state, you might have to challenge your brain a little more. Otherwise, you don't use 100% of your brain capacity and you don't get into a flow state. This has the negative side effect that it's more difficult to get into the flow state, but also the positive side effect that you're getting better at it, getting better at your activity. Or if you translate it into speed reading, you become a faster reader. And that's ultimately the goal that we want to achieve. Alright, that's all you need to know about the flow state. In our next section, we will take a look at the different applications of speed reading. Spoiler alert, it's more than just mere reading, but more on that in our next lesson. See you then. So far we've learned a lot about speed reading, but where can we apply all of that? Let's start with the thing that speed reading was created for, namely reading studies and specialized texts. The advantages of speed reading in this case are obvious. This kind of text is mostly read on the job, which is why every minute that you save while reading is a minute that you gain for other things. If you're employed, that's a great thing for your employer because he has to pay you less for reading or can give you more tasks because you're a more productive individual. And this raises your value for the company. And if you're self-employed, the benefits are obvious. You save time and you can use that time for other things that will help you earn more. Throughout this course, we've seen many methods and techniques, and especially when it comes to reading long, difficult texts, techniques like chunking, the extension of your viewing span, and skimming are really important. But it's also equally as important to set yourself a reading target, because otherwise you can get lost in these texts, and it's really important to know what you want to have from these texts. I mean, in most cases, you don't read these texts for fun, so you will probably have a specific goal that you want to reach with the text. And it's always important to keep that goal in mind. So the text should serve you, not vice versa. And in order to do that, the SQ3R method is also a really powerful method. Alright, so far with the obvious stuff. Before we move on with the applications that go beyond reading, in our next lesson we will first take a look how you can use speed reading to devour books. When people talk about speed reading, you often hear about people devouring books. Something that doesn't only help you at work, it also helps you in your spare time. As we already discussed, speed reading is not only about saving time, it is also about understanding more. And that's a pretty cool thing, also for reading in your spare time. Because you don't have to be annoyed by your inability to focus, but your level of concentration can even be high enough to reach a flow state. And that's a really cool experience. When you're reading for fun, methods like the SQ3R method or setting a reading target are not really the ones that you should use. Because like I said, you're reading for fun and not because you want to get some specific information. Reading in chunks can also be a great method for reading in your spare time. If on the other hand you only want one specific piece of information out of a whole book, always keep the Pareto principle in mind. Because most of the time you will find 80% of information in only 20% of the whole book. This means the other 80% are almost useless for you. They are there to increase readability and the number of pages. But if you only want to have specific informations, always keep in mind the Pareto principle. Good! Enough about the obvious applications of speed reading. Now we will come to the more surprising applications. Where else apart from reading can we apply speed reading? In our next lesson you will find out. Although speed reading is called speed reading, the principles that we've learned here can also be applied in multiple other areas of life. So it's not only limited to reading itself. For example, let's take the thesis that you are more concentrated the more of your brain capacity and activity requires. This can not only be applied to reading, you can also apply it, for example, when you're listening to an audiobook or watching a video. Most audiobooks and videos tend to have a good speed. But if you think that it's too slow and it's keeping you from concentration, try increasing the speed. Many video platforms and audiobook platforms nowadays allow you to either increase or decrease the speed. And if you play the audiobook or the video faster, your brain will automatically have to work a little harder. And this will help you keep on track and keep concentration high. The same also goes for learning a new language. Here again, the idea is really to challenge yourself, but not to overwhelm yourself. Try really to work at 100% of your brain capacity, but not to overwhelm it, to avoid frustration. And once you see that you make some progress, gradually make it more difficult. Set realistic goals and recognize your own achievements. Apart from that, like with any skill, learning a new language is influenced by your concentration, your motivation, and your background knowledge. My advice to increase your motivation are the same as for speed reading. And when it comes to background knowledge, it really makes sense to go from easy structures to more complicated structures. Both when it comes to words, so vocabulary, but also when it comes to grammatical structures. But you will see if you have a high level of concentration and a high level of motivation, this will almost go by itself. What we also learned in this speed reading course was to extend our viewing span or to train our peripheral vision. This doesn't only help you with reading, it helps your vision in general. Imagine you are at a crowded place in the city and you're looking for somebody. In this case, a good peripheral vision and the ability to focus multiple things at once will help you a lot. Apart from that, also from a medical standpoint, it's a good thing because your eyes always need different stimuli in order to keep or improve their function. By the way, that's also another reason why doing sports is a good thing, especially if your job includes looking at a computer screen all day long. And then finally, we have the SQ3R method and the method of text visualization. And the idea behind those two methods is really important nowadays because it's there to be able to gather and filter information. And in today's society where we're getting information in basically every second, no matter whether it's from our smartphones, via TVs, radios, computers, newspaper, friends, or whatever, it's always a good idea or a valuable skill to be able to gather the information that you need and to filter it. And these two methods can help you with that. You don't need a sheet of paper in order to do it. Just do the same steps in your head. Ask yourself, what do I need this information for? Or do I need it at all? And if yes, also reflect about it. What part does this piece of information play in the bigger picture? If you're able to ask yourself these questions in your subconscious, then that's a really, really valuable skill in the 21st century. And it can even take you to the next step, which is action. All of these techniques are there to enable you to act. If you are able to not only read something, but to actually act on what you read, you can basically learn anything. Because as I already mentioned, reading is basically just decoding information that other people have left us. If you can actually act on this information, then the sky is the limit. Then you can really do anything. So you see, the impact of speed reading goes way beyond mere reading. Alright, I would say now you are ready for our final test. We have one final reading assessment. Let's take a look at your progress. It is time for our fourth and final reading test. The procedure is again the same. All you need is a text that I will give you and a stopwatch, plus 1 minute of your time. And this time really try to read as fast as you can. Try to get as close to 400 words per minute as you can, and if you can, even exceed that. The sky is the limit. But of course, you should also understand what you read. That's why once 1 minute is over and after we've counted the words, we are gonna have another quiz. And the quiz will make sure that you've understood the main points of the text. After that, you will use the results of the quiz and the number of words that you've counted in order to calculate your effective reading rate. And I'm pretty sure that this time it will look much better than the first or second time around. Try to read in chunks, not in words. Try to have as little fixation points as you can and to avoid both regression and subvocalization. And then you're already ready to go. Let's start! You did it! Congratulations! You've passed your final reading assignment. I'm pretty sure that compared to the first one, you already made some great progress. But this doesn't need to be your final reading test. If you like, you can also create them on your own. This doesn't only help you to practice, it also shows you whether you've made more progress or whether you're stagnating. It is actually really simple. You only need to choose a text and then you need to stop your time. You can pick whatever text you like, but be aware that if you choose an easy text, it's kind of natural that you're able to read more words per minute than if you take a difficult one. Then use a stopwatch and read as much as you can of the text in 1 minute. Then count the words, or you can also use a WPM counter. By the way, this is also a great tool for choosing a text because it shows you how many words there are in a text. If your text, for example, only consists of 200 words, it's way too short. Ideally, it should have more words than you think that you are able to read in 1 minute. And then, once you're done reading and done counting, you can calculate your effective reading rate. This is a really good way of practice. So if you like, feel free to use it. I'm gonna link you both a WPM counter and a free link to a stopwatch. If by now you didn't achieve your goal, it really makes sense to do one of these assignments. And even if you did, practice is always valuable. And the more you practice, the better. It will teach you much more than a 1-hour course. Alright, enough about that. Congratulations again on passing your final assignment. And in our next and final section, we will have a little summary and we will take a look at some possible next steps that can wait for you on your speed reading journey. See you then. Alright, we've almost made it to the end of this course. That raises the question, what are the key takeaways of this course? Let's summarize and find out what the key takeaways are. First of all, it's important to understand that reading is a cognitive process which involves decoding symbols to derive meaning. And this means that reading is basically information acquisition. But in order to acquire this information, we first need to decode it in our brains. That's why reading doesn't happen on the page, it happens in your head. Put simply, we can say that we read in order to understand. In order to be able to learn how to read, you often first need to learn the language, especially if it's your mother tongue. Then the first step, and the step that you mostly learn in primary school, is to identify letters. So A, O, U. Or if you're from a country with a different writing system, you'll learn this writing system first. And this will then allow you to, in the next step, learn how to identify words. So for example, H-O-U-S-E becomes house. So you don't have to read each letter individually, you just read the word. And that's where, for most people, the journey ends. Those are the 2 steps that we learn at school. But they are only steps 1, 2, and 3 of 5. The next logical step would normally be to identify entire word groups. So for example, in the house becomes in the house. Or on the table becomes on the table. It's just the next level of abstraction. And it even goes one step further. Because you can not only read entire word groups or chunks at once, you can even identify entire lines at once. This takes a lot of practice, just like identifying letters and identifying words didn't happen overnight. But it is possible. The average reading speed in the OECD is around 150 to 200 words per minute. If we take a look at the effective reading rate, so the number of words that you're actually able to understand within 1 minute. But the best speed readers in the world didn't only manage to double or triple that number, they managed to increase it by 20 times. The current world record is 3,850 words per minute, which is insane if you think about it. But it shows us that it's possible. Out of all of the advantages of speed reading, there are 2 main ones. First of all, speed reading allows you to save a lot of time. And I really mean a lot. Reading is an integral part of our lives, and the less time we take for that, the more time we have for other things, or for more reading. And the second big advantage is that it makes you more concentrated. Which almost sounds too good to be true, but remember the 2 tips that I gave you about concentration. The first one was that multitasking is not effective at all, and that you need to go step by step. Because your brain works most effectively if it only needs to focus on one thing. And the other important thing is that this one thing at best requires 100% of your brain capacity, because your brain always works at 100% of its capacity. And if your task doesn't require 100% of it, it will look for other things that it can do at the same time. And as I just mentioned, multitasking is not effective. And if your brain does other things at the same time, that's also multitasking. Now, speed reading really requires your brain to work, especially if you compare it to traditional reading. And that is why it requires a lot more of your brain capacity and thereby also more of your focus and your concentration. And that is why if you use our speed reading techniques, you understand more. Remember, the 3 main factors for your reading success are focus, motivation, and background knowledge. And all of our speed reading techniques try to improve at least one of these 3 factors. I won't go over them now, but you can come back to all of the techniques and all of the exercises as often as you like. You have a lifelong subscription to this course and you can definitely use it. By the way, if you do that, you will probably see that from time to time I will change some of the activities and I will also add some new ones. Every month I'm trying to keep this course as fresh and updated as possible, and if there are some new things about speed reading or if I find some really good exercises, I will add them to this course. So feel free to check it out. Finally, let's take a look again at some possible applications, because we learned that not only our speed reading techniques come in handy for speed reading or for reading in general, it also helps you for other things of your life. For example, if you're listening to audiobooks or watching videos. Remember, the more of your brain capacity an activity requires, the more focused you become. And if an audiobook or a video is too slow, just increase the speed of it. This will help you become more concentrated. And basically all of the 3 areas, so background knowledge, motivation, and concentration, can also be applied for learning a new language. The more motivated you are, the better, especially if it's intrinsic motivation. Try to determine the tasks in a way that it really requires 100% of your brain capacity without overwhelming your brain, and gradually work your way up from easy things to more difficult things. Also, the extension of your viewing span and peripheral vision in general help you improve your vision in general and recognize things faster and easier. Plus, one of the most important things about speed reading is that it helps you gather and filter information. And that's a skill that, especially in the 21st century, is really, really important. Because every day there is so much information coming our way that it's really important to be able to filter it. And this will allow you to really get able to act. And that is really important. Because once you're able to act on things that you read, you can basically learn anything. The sky is the limit. And this is the power of speed reading. It is really a skill that is worth mastering and taking time for. I told you in the beginning that it's not a skill that you learn overnight, but if you keep practicing, I'm sure that you will achieve your goals and that it will help you tremendously. That is why in our next session, I will give you some recommendations for possible next steps. See you then. Congratulations, you did it! You've made it to the end of this course. At this point, you should already be able to observe significant improvements to your reading speed. But this doesn't need to be, and it also shouldn't be, the end of your speed reading career. What could some possible next steps look like? The most important next step is practice makes perfect. So keep practicing. As I already mentioned throughout this course, practice is really, really important in order to learn a skill like speed reading. Learning how to read letter by letter or word by word also didn't happen overnight. And the same also goes for speed reading. That's why practice is so important. You can do that, for example, by creating your own speed reading tests. You can find the instructions on how to do that in the course, or by repeating the techniques and exercises of this course. You have lifelong access to this course, so at any point you can always come back to this course and take a look at the lessons again, retake the quizzes, and also do all of the exercises again. And if you do so, you will very likely see that from time to time I'm going to change some parts of the course, and I'm also going to add new exercises and new activities. I always want this course to be on top on what happens in the speed reading world. And I also want to be it as practical as possible. Therefore, if you like, you can always come back to the course. Apart from that, simple but really important, keep reading. The more you read, the easier it gets and the faster you get. And if you stay on the ball, if you keep on track, I can guarantee you that you can and yet you will achieve your goals, if you haven't already. Speed reading is a great and important technique, and I'm really sure that it will help you a lot. This brings us to the end of this course. I hope you've had as much fun completing it as I had recording and creating it. And if yes, I would be really happy if you give it a good rating. Because that shows me that I did a good job. And it's what keeps me motivated to do more courses like this. But I'm also happy for your ideas on how I can improve the course. I'm open for every type of constructive feedback. And if you like, you can also write me a private message here on Udemy. As I already mentioned, I'm always trying to bring this course to the next level. Therefore, I'm really grateful for any suggestions for improvement. Apart from that, if you have any questions or if something is unclear, feel free to write me a message, or you can also use the Q&A section of this course. I will try to answer as fastly and as competently as possible. Thanks again for choosing and participating in this course. I'm really happy that you worked it all the way through until the end. And I hope to see you in one of my other courses soon. Take care, guys.